and especially if you're doing something like Facebook Connect, you may want to add people to your database with the Facebook credentials, and then add other information to the table as they decide to sign on to your service or not. So for every type of identity that comes into the service, like a Facebook credential, or any other service for that matter, like a Twitter one, you might want to store IDs and credentials for those services. And then you can extend that concept to people who are just visiting your site randomly, organically, just through search or what have you, by storing perhaps a cookie ID or an IP address in the database, and giving users who have that information in the table some kind of ability to do things on the site. And that way you can basically instrument your system a lot better. You can figure out whether there are people who choose not to sign up for your service but still come back to the site. And you can find out what the types of activities people do who end up not signing up for the service. So I figured this would be a really good place to sort of talk a little bit more about how you extend the account database. And there's a couple consequences, basically, to that discussion. And the question might come up. Sure.
Oh, just real quick, back to having kind of like a certain section for visitors, regular users.
Right.
How much do you want to use tools like Google Analytics and that stuff to do some of that for you, and how much you want to build your own?
Well, I think Google Analytics are great. It's actually a very, very powerful tool to understand what's going on your service, and it's a lot easier to put in place than building it yourself. It can't do everything for you, so you're still going to want to take some database statistics, as you develop your system. But it's extremely powerful, and in fact, one of the interesting things about Google Analytics is that over time, if your service becomes popular, Google itself uses some of the click information from Google Analytics to sort of define a pseudo sitemap for your service that describes the things that people hit most frequently. So, like if you're a news aggregator and your most important topic is politics, it might put the politics in as a link directly from a Google search result. So you can actually get some real benefit from it as well in the way Google describes your site. Let's see. And we'll definitely talk more about Google Analytics when we get to the analytics portion of the class. So one question that might come up about managing things like account databases is whether you want to normalize the data, and if you want to have separate tables for all of the different possible external accounts that you might have. Because you might have users that come in through IM, or they might come in through Facebook, or they might come in through an email address that they use. And I think as a general rule, I'd advise against normalizing an account database unless you have really very specific demands on reporting that require you to separate out all of the different things that a user might be doing. Otherwise, I would just sort of create like a single row for each user, so that whenever people sign on, the database access is as quick as possible. So I actually come from the database group at Stanford, and I love really nicely designed databases, but when I started building websites that had real performance requirements, I decided to focus on how to manage that no matter how big my service grew. On the other hand, a stats database you might normalize and separate out into all sorts of categories because you can't really predict the types of queries that you might run against a stats database ultimately. And since none of your users are going to hit it, you can structure it in the way that's actually best suited to respond to the queries that are needed, say, for your investors or what have you. Cool. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about normalization later on, but I thought this would be not a bad time to bring it up since we're already talking about the account database. And the other thing I wanted to talk about relating to the account database and mashups is what identity is becoming on the web. Because really I think this decade has been all about establishing individuals' identities online. And we're doing it in all sorts of different ways. And I think most people who use the web don't really see themselves as sort of creating a representation of themselves online. Especially, most people don't think that they're doing it in a persistent way. And in fact, all of the places that you visit, all of the logins that you do, etc., in aggregate form a representation of who you are and what you do. And I think it's very interesting to see how different web services use those various pieces of identity. And I think that it's one of the interesting things that you might want to think about when you're developing